Okay, I've tried launching the live a second time. I'm not sure if it's gonna work or not. Oh, it seems it's working this time. Okay, if you're watching, please leave a message in the chat so that I know that you are here, but at least now the counter says there are 19 people watching. Before it was saying 0. So if you're watching and it's working, please let me know. During that time, I'm going to redo the intro, basically, I guess. I just want to check on my phone if I go on YouTube, if it's live or not, because I have weird stuff on my streaming software. It's the first time I have this. And of course, it's the day. Yes, you are here. Thank you. So, context, story time. The first time I launched the live, I talked for 3 minutes, noticed it said 0 viewer, and apparently it didn't start the live. So now it seems everything is good, so perfect. We can start. So welcome, this is my training course to learn Combine. It's been one of the most requested topic in the comments of my YouTube channel, and I'm very proud to say that today, that's it. We are doing this content. So a few words to explain what this training course will be about. So this is a free training course to learn Combine, one of the few options you have on iOS to deal with asynchronous code. This is a training course will be delivered probably over 2 or 3 live streams of 2 hours each is going to be something like that. So shorter than the Swift UI course, but we will not be seeing everything today, this evening, or this day, depending on where you are in the world. If you are watching live, first, thank you for being here. And please don't forget that the big advantage of being live is that we can interact with each other. So any question or remark that you have, please tell me in the chat. First, because this way I can try and give you an answer, but also because the question or remark that you have watching live, people watching the replay will probably have the same question and remarks. And so by writing it in the chat, you're basically giving a voice to people that will be watching the replay. And I can guarantee you they will enjoy it if they get an answer because of you asking me the question. And last thing, if you are watching the replay, you will have a link in the description with the code on GitHub if you want to follow along with the code. If you're watching live, the link is already here, but for now the repo is empty because I haven't written the code yet. And finally, if you are watching the replay, you also have a link to Gumroad if you want to buy the course. It's basically the same content that you get, except that you have a button to download everything offline, and it's basically a tipping jar. You don't get anything more, just if you've enjoyed the course and you want to leave me a tip, you will have this link in the description to do it. That being said, let's get started. So first thing I always like to say, when is it? I'm recording this course. We are the 27th of July 2023, and I am using a version of Xcode. Let me tell you which, no, not about this Mac, about Xcode. I'm using Xcode 14.2. Always good to know if you are watching in the future and maybe, I don't know, there is a weird issue that you don't understand, you want to see what's happening. Okay. So I'm creating a new iOS project for now. So I'm creating a new iOS app. I'm gonna call it Basics of Combine because that's the name of this lesson. I'm gonna make it a Swift UI app. You could make it a UIKit app also, but for now I'm just going to run really Combine code, but outside of the UI. So it doesn't really matter what you choose. Choose Swift UI, choose Swift, so we all have the same thing. Then I'm gonna go on next. I'm gonna put this on my desktop because I'm not a very organized person. I'm also gonna make sure I see the chat because it was hidden. I'm gonna hide this, it's not useful. Okay, first thing I'm gonna do is create a new Swift file. I'm going to call it code. Okay, in code, I'm going to create a function. I will call it run, and it will basically be an entry point where I can write some code. So on my app, on my content view, I'm gonna use the modifier on app here, like this, and I will be calling my function run. So basically, this will be run whenever I launch my app in the simulator. So before I talk about Combine, I need to talk about the problem that Combine solves. So Combine is a framework that does functional reactive programming, and functional reactive programming is one of the ways to deal with asynchronous code at scale. One of the other possible ways would be async await, so what you have in Swift concurrency. So why was Combine introduced? Let's see how you used to handle asynchronous code in iOS before there was Combine. You would have used something called a completion handler. So you would have gotten something, a function like, for instance, fetch name. A function is going to fetch name over the network. And this function would not be returning a result, because that's what synchronous function do. It would be taking as an argument a completion handler, so a closure that would be called later once the result would be available. So this completion handler, it would take the form of an escaping closure that would take the result as an argument. Here the result is a string because I'm fetching a name, and the completion handler would return void because it's the function that will only be implementing side effects. I see some messages in the chat. So Enrico, you're saying, do you see a real use case of Combine in UIKit, especially after async await? That's a good point. We will go into it later, but basically to give you an answer, Combine is very good when you have complex workflows, when you need to combine, as the name suggests, several streams of asynchronous data. Async await can still do it with async algorithms, but async algorithm is a little bit unsafe by default. By the way, I have a live stream from last year on the differences between Combine and async algorithms. You can go watch later if you want. So I would say in UIKit, if you need to do a lot of asynchronous code with a lot of complex merging of streams, Combine can have an interest. And also another part where Combine can have an interest is code bases that relied a lot on Eric Swift, which was the open source, not competitor, but open source alternative to Combine. These code bases, when they move to SwiftUI, sometimes they prefer to use Combine because it's just more familiar to them. Their team is already trained. And sometimes if you had really a need for all the features of Eric Swift, Swift concurrency will not be enough for you probably. That being said, I also want to stress the fact that if you only need the basic use case of asynchronous code, like just making a network call, today Swift concurrency and async await is a better option than Combine. And hopefully I will be able to elaborate on this answer as we move along this training course. And so you were saying, yes, I won't have to wait for the view to appear if I put it in the init of the app. I'm trying to put it in a way where I feel like, if it's in on appear, it feels like a better quality of code of SwiftUI. It might be, like me being still influenced of having done the SwiftUI app, but indeed, you could put it in the init. The only reason why I didn't create a project that was a command line tool for macOS like I do when I only want to do code is because if you want to have a subscription that is kept alive, a command line tool is not the best. You need to add some extra code to make it keep running, and it's not like it's more complex than anything else. So let's go back to this asynchronous function completion handler style. So let's make it really asynchronous. So I'm going to use the dispatch queue API to do dispatch queue main async after. Interestingly, you can see that it takes also a closure, this API, this asynchronous API. So I will say, okay, after 2 seconds, you're going to execute, and so you will call the completion handler, and you will call it with the result. What's the result? It would be maybe the result of a network call. Here, I will just hardcode something so that it's simpler. The goal is not to show you how to make a network call. The goal is to show you why this code does not scale. So once you had written this code, inside your production code, you would do, for instance, fetch name. And once the name has been fetched, let's print it to the console, for instance. This code seems perfectly reasonable. What's great is that it's quite easy to write. You just pass in a closure that will be called at a later time when the result is ready, hence the name completion handler. And thanks to the trailing closure syntax in Swift that allows you to omit these parentheses, it feels very seamless. So let's run this code. Not in the iOS 17 simulator because I don't want unexpected issues. I already had enough of this at the beginning of the live stream. So it's running on the simulator. Let me make it a little bit smaller so that you can see it better, something like that. Okay, let's also make it maybe dark mode because, let's see. I think I need to wait for the app to start to put it to dark mode. And anyway, what I really want. Okay, so you can see it has printed to the console. So for now, it's working as expected. But now let's imagine that actually to fetch the name, we need to have a user ID. So for user ID, which will be an integer. But maybe to get this user ID, we also need to make another asynchronous call. So we have another method, fetch user ID. This might seem a bit ridiculous, but imagine that you have stored your data into a database which requires an asynchronous access. You could end up with this kind of code. So fetch user ID this time won't take any argument, but will return its result also through a completion handler. So this time the completion handler will take an int as an argument, so like that. And so it will be basically the same thing, except that I will just be changing the hard-coded value. I realize I had made a mistake here. Sorry for that. Okay. So now that I have my function, I need to call the two functions, the two asynchronous functions, one after the other. I need to chain a call with fetch user ID with a call to fetch name for user ID. So let's try and do this. So I will remove the code and first make the first call, so fetch user ID, all right? So user ID. And then I need to make the call to the second asynchronous method inside the completion handler of the first one, because I need to be able to use the user ID, and the only place where I can use it is inside the completion handler. And I provide a second completion handler in which I get the name, and finally I can print the name. I'm gonna run the code just so that we can see that indeed it's working as expected. Let's see. Yes, it's working as expected. And I see you don't see the console. Sorry, the console is here. So sorry if you didn't saw when it printed into the console, it's there. You can trust me. So you can see the problem starting to happen is that this code doesn't scale well, because every time I want to chain a new asynchronous call, I need to gain one level of imbrication of my code. This is a problem. If you've ever used code quality tools like linters, normally they have a rule where they use something that is called, I think it's called cyclomatic complexity, is the number of paths that there can be in your code, and the more you imbricate, nest is the right word in English, nest. The more you nest functions into each other, the more this cyclomatic complexity increases, and the harder your code gets to be read. If I had like 3 calls to make, I would need to nest 3 times, and even worse, let's imagine that we need to deal with errors, for instance. So now, instead of having just an int, I have a result to an int or an error. Same thing for the second call. So result string error, like that. You know what? I'm gonna make a bit more room. So like this. Now, actually, so here I need to wrap this into not dot result, it's dot success, like that. And here, same thing, need to wrap it into a success. No, it's here that I wanted to wrap it into a success, like that. Okay, well, now I need to deal with the possible error cases. So here I need to do, okay, so I'm going to switch on the user ID result. So let's rename this into result. So case I get a user ID, then I can call fetch name, okay? If there is a failure, I will need to do something like that, and I will add a break, because otherwise it's going to refuse to build. And so here now is the same thing. I've got my name result. I need to switch over my name result. Okay, I can get a name here. I can finally use the name. Here I also need to deal with the failure. Actually, that's what I should have written right here, not just do something, but deal with the failure. And it could be a complex business logic. Sometimes in some apps, the business logic associated with failure cases is even more complex than the normal, than the happy path of your code. Okay, let's see. Does this build? Yes. It builds, and right now, I'm sure that when you see this code, you are convinced that with only 2 calls, this code is totally unmanageable. It's getting out of hand, it's growing in every possible direction. Imagine if we had 6 calls, 7 calls, 8 calls. I once worked in an app in Objective-C, so with even less type safety, where there was like a dozen of these calls being nested at the launch of the app. And then one day you're told, oh, can you switch the order of call 3 and call 7? And then it's a lot of fun, like switching the else clause and all of this kind of nice stuff. So this doesn't scale. And one of the answer to this problem was to introduce async await. So to say, let's make it so that asynchronous function can just return a value, except that we cannot call asynchronous functions everywhere, but they can return a value and we can await their return. That's the first approach. In a way, it's kind of like, linearizing an async function. The word isn't correct, but you get the idea that I mean, I hope. And the other approach is to do functional reactive programming, which is kind of like structured programming. It's introducing control flow statements, but to deal with closures. Instead of just passing raw closures as completion handlers, we pass more specialized closures to deal with maybe transforming a result into the result of another call, consuming the result, combining 2 calls together, these kind of things. This is what Combine is all about, and this is what we are going to see into this training course. And I see, Bruno, you're saying, lol, nesting async functions. Did this a lot when I started as an iOS developer. Haha, mainly using closures. Yeah, and to be fair, in Objective-C, that's mostly like the code was kind of directing you to this. There was reactive Cocoa, but because it wasn't strongly typed or not as much as Swift, there was a lot of boilerplate you had to write. So yeah, like we all did it in the beginning. You also had the API, you also had NS operation, which was the API from Apple to be able to chain operations together, but it was a lot of heavy lifting, a lot of code to write, and most of the time, like you didn't feel the need. Like if you had to decouple the creation of your task, then yes, maybe you would need it. But when all of your tasks, like the order you called your task was static and always the same, you ended up like nesting completion handlers, and it was hell. But luckily, 4 years ago, in 2019, Apple gave us Combine. So Combine was introduced with iOS 13. You will not be able to use Combine before iOS 13, but now iOS 13 is old enough that a lot of apps can start using it in production. And what's great is that Combine evolved a bit in iOS 14, but not that much since then. I would almost say like not at all, I'm just not 100% sure. But basically, if you're using iOS 14, you have either all the features of Combine or 99% of them. And with iOS 13, I think the only part are missing. You can always re-implement them yourself. They're not that hard to re-implement. So what is Combine about? I'm going to remove this code. So Combine is all about processing values over time. If you look at the documentation of Combine from Apple, this is what you will see in the intro. Combine is a framework to process values over time. It means that values will be produced over time by producers, and they will be transformed and then consumed by consumers. And so in what I said, you can see that Combine is a framework that allows you to implement the producer-consumer design pattern. If you've done Eric Swift, I think I mentioned it a bit in the beginning, it's very similar. If you know Eric Swift, learning Combine is basically learning the new names for concepts that you are already familiar with. So let's see and take a look at what your typical Combine code looks like. So I remove my run function, I will put it back again. And if you remember the SwiftUI training, what I really like to do is to take a look at the protocols that the typical types that you will use in Combine implement. This way you really get to have to get a good like lay of the land. You see what the landscape looks like. So we will start with the first of these protocols, which is called Publisher. So first thing, if you don't know how to open this quick access window, it's Command-Shift-O. If you've never used it, it's going to change your life. And so make sure you choose Publisher, not Publishers. It's something different. We will see what it is just a bit after. So Publisher, it's a protocol What's kind of nice is that it's quite a simple protocol. That's always good when the basic building blocks is simple. It's a protocol with two associated types, so output and failure. You can see that output can be anything. It could be a string, it could be an int, it could be a complex object that you have created in your code base, a complex type that you have created in your code base, and a failure. And the failure must conform to the protocol error. An error in Swift is basically an empty protocol. Any type can conform to it. It's just a way to say, hey, you need to consider me as an error. So you can implement error on an enum, for instance. Maybe we'll do it a bit later. And then you can see that we have the method receive, which will allow us to attach a subscriber to the publisher. So we've seen what publisher is about. Now let's see what subscriber is about. So let's do a command click and jump to definition. And you can see there is an interesting symmetry. So I see you're asking Guillermo, did I miss out on much? No, I just saw the why compression handler sucks to scale correctly as an introduction, and now we're just getting started. We saw what the publisher protocol was about. We are seeing what the subscriber protocol is about. So you have basically not missed anything. So subscriber, as I was saying, similar vibe to the publisher. We see a nice symmetry, which makes sense because in the publisher, in the producer-consumer pattern, there is indeed an obvious symmetry. So input, the kind of value subscriber receives. So input can be, once again, anything, and failure has to be an error. And we can see that there are a few methods to be able to receive a subscription. So first, you have a method to say that you have subscribed and you say how many items you want to query. So this feels a bit low level, and rightfully so. Most of the time you don't need to implement this. At some point later in the course, I will make you implement a custom subscriber just so that you know how it works under the hood. But most of the time you use things like maybe you've seen sync, map, this kind of things, and they will take care of all this heavy lifting. But the bottom line is that the receiver is able to say to the publisher, so the subscriber can say to the publisher, hey, I want to only get 3 items maximum, or unlimited items, or no items. The consumer has control over how many items it receives, and we see that it's an important idea in the way that Combine was designed. And then this method is called whenever there is a new input, and as you can see, you return a demand, so you once again say how many new items you want to receive following this first item that you have received. And finally, another method for the completion event, and completion event is an enum, if we take a look, which can be either finished or failure. So if you've seen Eric Swift, you might see here a slight difference in the design. In Eric Swift, you're used to providing maybe 3 closures. So on next for the next value, whenever there is a new value produced, on error when there is an error, and usually I think it's on completion when there is when the sequence has completed. And in Combine, it's a bit different. You have on new value basically. And then you have on completion, and completion is an enum which can be either normal completion or failure. Personally, I find this choice from Combine to be slightly more correct, even though it feels a bit different when you write it. The reason is that with Eric Swift, since you have on next, on error, on completion, it doesn't make it obvious that when there is an error, it also terminates the completion. Whereas here, since the error case is inside the completion, is a sub case of the completion case, you can see that an error implies a completion. It's more obvious, and I think it's a little bit better. So I see someone saying, please come to the point. The intro might be a bit long. It's on purpose because the goal is not to just show how to write some basic Combine code. Is to give some as much context as possible. And so if you haven't used Eric Swift, it might not speak to you, but there are a lot of people who want to learn Combine who have a background in Eric Swift. That's why I'm also trying to make these comparisons, at least for the introduction. So as always, I have my little script on my other screen to make sure I'm not forgetting to say everything. So I've told you everything I wanted for the subscriber, and now we're going to scroll a bit more and take a look at subscribers with an S. So this time we are in an extension, so I'm going to command click because I actually want to see the actual definition. you can see that you cannot make more simple than this. It's an empty enum called subscribers, and this is actually a trick that is used quite a lot across the Swift and library and some of the Swift frameworks from Apple and also some third-party frameworks, is that in Swift you don't really have a namespace keyword. You have packages that provide an implicit namespace, but you don't have a way to create a namespace just for a file. And so the way that you kind of emulate a namespace is by nesting a type into a parent type. And when you use an empty enum as the parent type, you basically create a type that cannot be instantiated. You cannot create an instance of this enum because it has no cases. And so the only way you can use subscribers is as a way to define in extension subtypes, and that you can refer to this subtype by doing, for instance, subscribers.sync. So subscribers, it's a namespace, and I agree with you, Prathamesh. I wish Swift had explicit namespaces because this trick feels very low level and it feels so counterintuitive to the philosophy of Swift of being very like explicit and not feel like like a C kind of a language. But still, once you know about it, you can better understand the way it works. And so, what do we find in this namespace, for lack of a better word? So a namespace. What's a namespace? Good remark. A namespace is basically a way to create like a sense of hierarchy. Like when you create a function top level, as the name suggests, it's at the top level, so you can call it from anywhere. And if you create a function called f at the top level somewhere in your app, you cannot create another f in another part of your app, because then you would have a conflict and you would need a way to disambiguate between the two functions. And that's what namespaces offer. They allow you a way to nest declarations into a parent name. This way you can do namespace dot name of the type. So that's their purpose, basically to allow you to organize your code base. And so in this subscribers namespace, we can see a first type. So it's a class called sync. So sync is what you use when you want to consume a value. So usually it's what you have at the end of your pipeline. It's where you implement the side effect, because as the name reactive functional programming suggests, most of our code will be functional code, so code without side effects, code that is entirely defined by its input and outputs. But at some point, we still need to do a side effect. We still need to change the world in some way, and changing the world might mean writing to the console or displaying something on the screen. And so we usually do it in a sync. So this is where we get the value. The name sync, I think it comes from mathematics, at least. When you do like state machines in English, the end state of a state machine is called the sync. So I think this is what the names come from, even though I'm not 100% sure. And so most of the time you will not be using this class directly. We will see that there is actually a convenience method that you call on a publisher to say, I want to sync and pass a closure to get the value. So this is kind of similar if you've been using SwiftUI. In SwiftUI, you can create a modifier, but you don't call it by passing the modifier struct. You actually create also an extension on Vue to have a better syntax. You will see that there is the exact same syntax in Combine. So sync, it implements receive value, receive completion, and basically it's a convenience API that will allow us to just pass closures, and then the class sync will take care of asking the publisher for new values and feeding them into the closure that we have passed to the sync. Okay, last thing I want to show you is that there is a notion somewhere. Yes, there is a notion of canceling. We will go back to it later, but the notion of canceling is important because when you have an active subscription, you need a way to cancel it, to close it at some point. Otherwise, you have memory leaks. And so we will focus a little bit more later on how do you cancel subscriptions? How do you make sure that your app doesn't leak memory? So we've seen subscribers. Of course, now let's go see publishers. So publishers with an S, because I want the enum. You can see it with the E here in the thumbnail. So publishers, same logic. It's also an a namespace, so an empty enum. And in publishers, we will find a lot of things, and we will find the operators that we would call on our subscriptions, that we would call on our async streams. It's very hard to use the wrong word, subscription publisher, so forgive me if I make a mistake here. Are we going to define custom publishers and subscribers later? We will define, I think, one of each, but not today. In a later session, because it's more complex, and to be honest, I've never needed to do it. Like I wanted to show it because for the sake of needing it, but I've never been in a case where I needed to do it. Usually, you combine existing. Once again, the word combine comes naturally into speech, and you combine existing publishers together to get what you need. And for sync, you either do a sync or you add some calls to deal with the back pressure. So for instance, we can see in the publishers things like subscribe on, which will allow you to make sure that your observing code is run on a particular thread, particularly useful if you want to update the UI in your sync. And I want to scroll a bit to show you, maybe, yes, we can see a lot of the functional primitives like filter. So we will see in the publishers filter, map, reduce, flat map. Once again, here it's the type version, but we will also have a way to just call a method map on a publisher to have a simpler syntax. We can see breakpoint, a way to trigger a breakpoint whenever your subscription triggers a new value. There is also a debug one that is very useful and we will be using a lot. All satisfy, basically, all of the primitives you can call on a sequence in Swift, most of them, they will have an equivalent over publishers. And very often there is a try version because you want to be able to deal with potential errors. So we could see, if we kept scrolling, we could see drop while, combine latest, etc. And I think if we keep scrolling, so you can see that there is a lot of scroll, like the scrolling indicator is very small. Oh, we can see encode here, encode and decode. So there is some built-in way to interact with decodable. And I want to reach the method just because I want to show them to you. So here we have the merge. We are getting there. Okay. I'm scrolling a lot, but I hope I will find it. If I don't, it's okay. I will move on, but I would really like... Yes, they are here. So here you can see the method. So for instance, when your publisher publishes a sequence that never fails, you can also call on it, for instance, the minimum value, and you give it a closure to compare two elements. You have the method to call all satisfy. So these are convenience methods you would call on a publisher, and under the hood is going to create the publisher we've seen just above, but you just need to pass in a closure. This way the API is easy to use for you. Okay, I will stop because we could keep scrolling, and once you've gotten the idea about it, there is no point on going over all of the values. So let's actually start and write our first combine code. So to start, we'll start with the most simple thing we can do, which is to create a publisher that returns a single value. I shouldn't use the word return. If you hear me use the word return, it's not a good choice of a word because return makes it think that a publisher is a function. It's not. So I should say a publisher that produces a value or that yields a value. But if you hear me say a producer returns a value, in your head, switch it to like produces a value, because it's not a function returning a value and then moving on to something else. So how do I create a producer that only yields or produces a single value? We use this producer called just. And before you use just, don't forget to import combine. Otherwise, you won't get access to it. So just, it's a way to take a basic value like an int and to lift it into a publisher that produces ints. If you're wondering where the name just comes from, it comes from mathematics, it comes from algebra, and more specifically from category theory, because reactive programming is based for the theoretical part on category theory. So this is a mathematical word. That's why it feels a little bit weird when we are used to more like Apple oriented, iOS oriented naming, but that's where it comes from. And so just if I look at the type, you can see that it's a publisher that will yield a simple value. It can't fail with an error because it's not possible. It just produces a value and it will only produce a value once. But since we have our publisher, we can start and do things with it. For instance, we can listen to the value. So for this, I told you we use sync and we don't use the class sync that we've seen. Instead, we use the method sync on the publisher and we can call it with two possible flavors. Either we just provide the closure receive value, or we also provide the closure for receive completion to deal with the error and the regular completion case. Here I will just do receive value. And so once I have my value, I need to do something with it. And for lack of a better idea, I will just print it to the console. If I build this code, I should have a warning. You see that the compiler is telling me result, trying to show it, but I'm afraid I am, yes. Result of call to sync receive value is unused because we are not dealing with the subscription. We are not dealing with storing the subscription. Still, I'm going to run this code because it's interesting to see what's happening. So I'm running this very simple code. And as you can see, let me put the simulator off screen because it's not useful for us right now. You can see that the value has indeed been printed to the console. Now, let's imagine that I had a small delay. So I say I want to delay by 1 second. So it will not, I mean here, since there is only one value, it's the argument is kind of moot, but delay, it delays the start of the publisher. It wouldn't delay each individual value by 1 second. It would delay the production of the first value by 1 second. Important to keep that in mind because it's very easy to make that mistake, to use delay and thinking it will put a delay between every elements, and it won't. We will see later how to do that. So for the scheduler, I will just say I want to use the main queue as the scheduler. So the scheduler, you can really see it as the thread on which your code will be executed. And so now, if I run my code, you will see that nothing gets printed to the console, even after the 1 second delay has elapsed. It's not a mistake. The reason is because since I am not storing the subscription anywhere, it gets immediately deallocated once the function return, the function run has returned. Why did it run before? It's because since there was no delay and I was using the just publisher, which is a very special publisher that already knows its value and produces it immediately, the code to sync was actually executed immediately. Remember, asynchronous code is code that can be executed later. It doesn't mean that it has to be executed later. It can be executed later, but later being 0 seconds, you know. So in that particular case, because the code was executed immediately, even though I was not storing the subscription, the code was still being executed, but with a real or a more real world subscription where the value will be produced at a later time, later being a non-zero interval of time, then I need to store the subscription, otherwise it will be deallocated and so my subscription will be cancelled. This is actually a good thing because first you get a warning from the compiler telling you, hey, I think you've made a mistake here. And also it means that by default, your code will not be leaking subscriptions. It's still possible if you store them incorrectly that it will still leak a subscription, but by default it won't. So this is quite a good design decision in my opinion. And when you compare it with async algorithms, it's the opposite. A task will start, and if you don't dispose of it properly, it might never stop. So that's one of the reasons I was saying that Combine can be better than async algorithms, at least in the shape that async algorithm is in as the date of today, so end of July 2023. So all that to say, how do we store the subscription? We need to store it, well, not inside the body of the function. We need to store it outside. We need to store it at a place where it will have a lifetime long enough for the subscription to be able to be executed. So here I'm going to store it as a global variable of my app. In a real app, please don't do this. You would be storing it, for instance, on your view model. So first, before I tell you where to put it, let's see first how do we store actually, because I didn't tell you how you store a subscription. So if we look at what sync returns, you can see that it returns an any cancelable. You know how I like to do things. Let's take a look at what is any cancelable. So I'm going to open it. Any cancelable, you can see it's a class that conforms to cancelable, also to hashable, because as you will see, we will often be storing it in a set, and in a set you need to store hashable elements. And you can see that when you create it, you give it a cancel closure, and basically any cancelable will call its cancel method. Let me redo it. When you create an any cancelable, you give it a cancel method. So you won't be creating it yourself. It will be created for you by the method sync, but it will give the cancellation method of the subscription as the closure. And then any cancelable has a cancel method that you could call either explicitly to cancel the subscription, but also inside its deinit. So you cannot see it in the public API, but inside the deinit of any cancelable. So when any cancelable is deallocated, it calls cancel. And what you do usually is that you store the any cancelable on another object. This way you tie the lifetime of the subscription to the lifetime of that other object. For instance, you would put the subscription for a user event on a given screen on the view model for that screen. This way, when the screen is deallocated, the view model is deallocated, and the deinit of the any cancelable is called, which cancels the subscription. So really think about it this way. Any cancelable is a way to tie the lifetime of a subscription to that of another object. We are basically piggybacking on the existing lifetimes of pre-existing objects in our apps. And indeed, you're perfectly right, Mohammed. Any cancelable is very similar to a dispose bag in RX Swift. So here I said I'm going to store my set of any cancelables at the top level of my app. This is bad because it means that the subscription will be kept alive as long as my app is running. It's good for this small demo, but in a real app, please don't do this unless this is what you really want to do. There could be valid reasons where you want subscription to always keep running while your app is executing, but most of the time it's not what you want to do. You would probably want to put actually this inside maybe a singleton or another instance. Like I have a hard time imagining a situation where it makes sense to actually put it at the top level, because you want to have a namespace. You don't want to have this globally. You want it to be nested into something. So we come back to the reason why do we need namespaces in computer science. So cancelables, the hard thing when you write it is to know whether it should take one or two L's. You have a spell check in Xcode, so Xcode can help you with that. And so it's a set of any cancelable, and I create that set. And how do you store the any cancelable return by sync? So you don't have to do something like cancelables dot insert. I mean, you could do this, but this syntax would suck a lot because it kind of buries the lead, like it puts everything inside a level of indentation when this is absolutely not what you want. So fortunately, we don't do this. What we do instead is that on the any cancelable, we do store in and we pass in the cancelable. You can see this little ampersand here, which is because the argument we pass into the method is in-out. This means that the method is allowed to modify the value, which makes sense because here we want to modify the set. We want to add a new value in the set. So it's actually quite rare that you pass in-out arguments, because in Swift it can be kind of like a sign of a code smell. But here, this nice little convenience API is one of the rare instances where in-out arguments make sense. And so now that the subscription is being stored at the level of the lifetime of our app, if I relaunch my code, normally we should see in the console 1 second after my app has been launched, we can see that in the console, we have printed 42, which means that the sync closure was indeed executed. So we have run our most basic Combine code. You might be thinking, what's the purpose, what's the goal of knowing about this Just producer? Because in a real app, you won't be using it most of the time. It actually has some very interesting use cases. You can use Just, for instance, when you are writing a test, when you are writing a mock, when you are prototyping. So basically, anytime when you want to run a mock, you can use Just. Let's imagine that you have a function that returns the publisher to return to network call. You can have, when you are running your real app with the live services, make the network call. But when you are running it in a mocked environment, you just do just your mocked hard-coded value, and this way everything is going to work super nice. All right. So now I'm checking, as always, that I've done everything that I wanted to show you. Okay, storing DNA cancelable. Now, what's the next step? The next step is to try and be a little bit more ambitious. We've made a publisher that only returns one event immediately, that only produces one event immediately. Let's try to have a publisher that produces more than one event, for instance. So how do you turn an array into a publisher? So first, let's create an array. Here we have a very nice array with, like, I'm going to put what? Like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 integers into the array. You might be tempted to think, okay, let's put this into a Just publisher. Just going to put it a little bit nicer, easier to read. And I'm going to copy paste that code to see what's going to happen. Just before I run it, try to take the time to wonder what's going to happen. And the reason I'm asking is because there could be two possibilities. Either it could be a publisher that publishes an array once, or a publisher that publishes each of the elements in the array. Actually, there is only one result that kind of makes sense, and if you look at the code above, it should be pretty obvious which one it is. So I'm still going to run the code just to show you. And as you can see, indeed, it is only returning the array once. It is only producing the array once. And this is a mistake, especially if you're new to reactive programming, to functional reactive programming. A mistake that is very easy to make is to get confused between a publisher of arrays and a publisher that publishes value, and that you can see kind of like an array that produces value over time. But the two things are very different. And actually, if you want to turn this array into a publisher that will publish every value one at a time, it's super easy. Just call .publisher on the array. I think actually it works on every sequence, not only on every collection. And it allows you to turn a sequence into a collection. And now, so I'm going to comment the code just above so that it is easier to read in the console. If I run the code, we will see that now you can see we have every value being printed on its own line. It's because this publisher will produce first 1, then 2, then 3, then 4, then 5, and then finally completion, but we're not listening for the completion event. Let me see. I see a few questions. Liam, you're saying, can Combine do everything Async Await can do? And are there any differences in capability? Short answer, Combine can do everything Async Await can do. It's just a different syntax, and the fact that something that are done automatically for you in Async Await and in Swift concurrency, I'm thinking typically of the async-led syntax. You have to do it manually in Combine, but Combine is more general purpose than Async Await, whereas Async Await is very good to write simple asynchronous code with the bare minimum syntax that you need. And I would say, as an iOS developer, knowing the two, at least knowing, even if you use Async Await mostly at work, knowing a bit of how Combine works is always a good thing, because SwiftUI up until and including iOS 16 uses Combine under the hood for to publish changes. So it's always good to know like how your tools are working under the hood. Just like when you use UIKit, you don't need to know in details how core animation works, but since UI view is a wrapper around the CA layer, having an idea, a big picture idea of how core animation works can help you whenever you have a tricky situation to deal with UI Kit. And a great question from Omar, how any cancellables, I'm just making it more visible, how any cancelable saves us from memory leak. If we had no any cancelable, the subscription would stay in memory forever until we explicitly canceled it. And so by storing the any cancelable into a set of any cancelable, we can tie the lifetime of the subscription to that of the object that is holding the set of any cancelable. So here it's my app. So the subscription will still be kept alive as long as my app is running, but I could put the set of any cancellables, inside my view model, and then when my view model gets deallocated, my subscriptions stored inside the set of any cancelable will also be deallocated. There are some functional reactive frameworks that don't use this paradigm. For instance, RX in its JavaScript declination, RX JavaScript, you can, or even in RX Swift actually, in RX Swift you don't have to use the dispose bag. You can use the take until approach, where you say, for instance, I want to receive these events until the view is alive. And you say, okay, take events until view is alive, for instance. The syntax is different, but you get the idea. But the thing is, if, for instance, your view is not deallocated for some reason, then you will be leaking, and it's very easy to do a take until on an event that actually has a longer lifetime than what you expected. So what's great with a set of any cancellables is that if your app is working correctly, you already trust that your view model is being deallocated when you expect it to be deallocated, and so by storing your subscriptions inside the view model, you also ensure that the subscriptions are being deallocated when the view model is deallocated. And since it's deallocated when it should be, then so are your subscriptions. So you are basically like piggybacking on the fact that you have objects with proper lifetimes in your code base. So what did I want to show you next? Oh yes, I think I want to show you a very, very, very useful, a very, very useful modifier. But first, I wanted to start and use some transformations. Let's do a filter, for instance. So if you've ever written any kind of Swift, it's very possible that you've used filter on sequences. You can use it also on publishers, and the API is still the same. You pass in a predicate as a closure. So it's a function that will take as an argument the value and that will return a Boolean. And so here, for instance, I could say, okay, I want to filter, so I only want to keep the values which are odd numbers, so values for which is multiple of 2 will be equal to false. So like this. Of course, I'm writing the full syntax here so that it's very clear what's happening, but you can definitely use the shorthand syntax $0 if you want. I'm just going to keep it so that it stays in the code. I will commit later. And are there any benefits to using take until in RX Swift? Honestly, I never came across that situation. Once I thought I was clever by using take until and then realized I was just shooting myself in the foot. So there is no real reason. I think the reason is because since RX is an API that exists across languages, there are languages where you cannot really do the dispose bag trick, maybe in JavaScript, for instance, but I'm not 100% sure. And so they had to have this equivalent API for other languages, and they also offer it in RX Swift, but I've never been into a situation where I needed it. Not to say that it doesn't exist, but in the kind of app that I was writing at the time, so like banking apps, very like web service oriented, never needed to use it. And are there any benefits to using RX unless your project crosses different languages? Great question. Today, I would say if you support iOS 13 or above as a minimum, you can use Combine. It does the same job, and it's even more easily compatible with SwiftUI. Most of the big projects that use RX Swift is because they started before Combine was available. Like the project I used to work on for a big French bank, it started. When did it start? It started in 2016, April 2016, and so back then Combine was not yet available, and Eric Swift was the next. I was about to say the next the next best thing, but no, it was the only available best thing basically. I think there was also another competitor, but it was less popular. Okay, let me go back to my script. Okay, so I've done a filter. When you've done a filter, you also want to do a map. This way you can test, the one where you return just a Boolean and the one where you return a new value. So here I'm going to map and I will just square the result. So let's run this. Normally we should see 1, 9, and 25. Let's see. We do see 1, 9, and 25, so perfect. The API works just as we expected. So first, here we can see, one of the very good selling point of Combine is that if you're used to writing Swift, it's pretty like intuitive in the sense that all of this part right here, you're used to it. This stuff here is new, and the dot publisher also here is new, but it's more like you're just calling a complete property here. But this part here is the new part, but the rest is familiar to you, and it's one of the great features of Combine. They really made this effort of using the same signature than the API that we already have in Swift. And I wanted to show you this great not modifier, operator. That's the word we use in Combine. I don't think I said it, but the word for these things is operator, actually. Similar to modifiers in SwiftUI, but they're called operator in Combine. And so the print operator is going to print everything that happens to the console. So you can see it says, okay, receive value 1, 9, and then 25. But what's great is that if I move it around, so for instance, I put it after the filter, now it will say, okay, receive value 1, 3, and 5, because these are the values that went through the filter and that made it through the filter. And if I put it just after we've created the publisher, then you will see that all the values will arrive. And you can see that we also have the request max because it says how many values did filter request for, but you can ignore that. You can see it as like low level stuff leaking a bit. So print is very useful because if you want to debug, most of the time you might want to add a sync to or to change the existing sync. You can just put a print anywhere in your code, and it should help you a lot. You also have a breakpoint. So breakpoint, let me use it. Breakpoint is going to trigger whenever the code reaches this part. So let's see. And of course, it didn't trigger. So let's see why. It's supposed to raise. Okay, when a provided closure. So you need to. Okay, you still need to do something for it to work. Trying to see if there are other. So you need to do something a little bit extra. I don't want to go into detail about it. What I wanted to highlight is that breakpoint is very possible that in production is going to do a crash. So if you use it, make sure to remove it before you go to production. Probably you might want to add a rule in your linter that this shouldn't be in code that you commit, because I'm not 100% sure that it crashes your app in production, but there is at least a risk, and you want to make sure that you don't trigger that risk. A question: how do I define @word myself? Can you explain what you mean by this? I'm not sure what you mean by @word actually. I see another question from Jamil. What level of logic complexity or scenario you think that using functional reactive programming framework is more efficient? I would say when you need to do, for instance, things like combine latest, zip, this kind of things. If you don't need that, if you're just like making a call, making maps, flat maps, and then syncing, basically async await is much better for you in most situations. There is of course exceptions, but in most situations it should be better. All right, looking at the time, it's almost 1 hour, slightly less because of the small issue at the beginning, but it's great because it means that I'm perfect timing to move on to the second part of this first session, where we're going to write more real-world code. I think I'm going to have us write, yes, a network call, because when you talk about asynchronous stuff, a network call is the typical thing you want to do. And I just looked at my streaming software. We are 25. You are 25 watching, which is pretty great for a training course during the summer at the end of July. 29 now. Wow. So thank you all for being here. I knew that you had asked a lot for Combine, and I'm glad to hear that to see that when I've made it, they are definitely you are definitely here to watch it. So for the network call, what are we going to do? First, on my second screen, I'm going to open the finished version so I don't make any mistake, because in France, it's 9 p.m. for me and I had a big day at work, so I'm a bit tired and I can make mistakes very easily when I'm tired. And also, I think I've already made some code, because otherwise it would take too much time. So let's see. Actually, we're going to create a new project from scratch. This way, when I will commit it into GitHub, it will be easier. So once again, making an iOS app, and this time I will call it network call. So like that, Swift UI and Swift. Okay. We are going to put it also on the desktop for me. Let me just make sure that the Xcode window is at the right size so that you can see it in the live stream. Perfect. Okay, like that. I'm gonna hide the preview for now. And so we're going to make a network call. If you've been following my videos, you know that I love to use the MovieDB API for this. So this will not be an exception. So if you've seen my SwiftUI training course, you should feel a bit at home. Also, I will be copy pasting a lot of boilerplate code, because I don't want to write like a big code to write the data model. So if you're watching live, I'm sorry, I don't have this code already on GitHub, because this week has been very busy. I don't have time to put it there beforehand, but you can still look into the repo of the SwiftUI training course, or you can just try to write it and to write a simplified version of it. Usually, I will try to make it so that you have time to write the code. So let's see what we're going to implement. I will take my content view and I will rename it into movies view. First, because it's a better description, and also because it's the same name than in my finished project. And remember, I'm tired. I want to minimize the risk for errors. All right. So my movies view. What am I gonna do? For now, I'm not going to do anything. I'm just going to implement a movies view model, actually. Actually, no. That's why I have a script to remind me in which order I should do things. I should first show you how to implement the method fetch movies, because this would be a great entry point. So for this, we're going to create a new file. We're going to call it network, like that. And we're going to create a second new file, which we're going to call models. So in models, this is where I'm going to come and copy paste a lot of things. So I'm adding a global constant as a JSON decoder with the right key decoding strategy given the API I'm querying. And then I have a struct for a movie. So very basic, decodable, equatable, identifiable. And there is an ID, a title, an overview, a poster path, and a poster URL. Movie response, which has an array of movies. And then for a little bit later, we have the cast members of the movie and the reviews of the movie. For now, we will just be using this movie right here to be able to write our code. So if you want to write the code during the live, I'm giving you a few more seconds to take a screenshot of this, and you have the time to write it on your own, because in 3, 2, 1, I will need to go back to the network code, and in the network code, we are going to make our first network call. First, I'm just going to go into the models very quickly. I'm moving the window into my other screen. Can you guess why? Because, of course, I'm writing my API key where you can see it. Okay, so Now that I am back into the network call, it's time to write the function to fetch the movies. So I'm calling it fetch movies. This function will return a publisher. So since I want to return a publisher, I will import combine. And so here, what should be the return type? If you see a lot of tutorials, blog articles about combine, even WWDC sessions, you will see that they use the type any publisher most of the time. And any publisher, it's a type that allows you to do type erasure on your publisher. Why would you want to do type erasure on your publisher? Let me go back to the previous project. I forgot to show you one thing. What's the type of the result to calling map? It's a publisher of a sequence of T. And basically, what I want to show you, same thing. What's the result of filter? It's a publisher to a sequence of a publisher to a sequence. Remember how in SwiftUI the types are being nested? Is the same thing in Combine. And of course, here we don't want to say, okay, it's going to be a publisher that then does a filter, then does a flat map, then does something else, because first it would be hell to write and maintain, and also it would be basically exposing the entire implementation strategy inside the signature of the function, and that's not what you want. So when Combine was first introduced, there was the type erase wrapper any publisher that is still like publisher. It takes the two generic arguments, so the output, so here it's movie response, and the error type, and it's basically kind of similar to any view in SwiftUI because it's a type erase publisher, but with one key difference is that any publisher is not as bad as any view. We saw in SwiftUI that any view is really bad and you should try to avoid it whenever you can because there is a huge performance, there are huge performances implications. It's not the case with any publisher. It was just the way back then to have a nice return type to put in the signature of the function. Why do I say back then? Is because now there is something even better in Swift that we can use because of the recent addition to Swift last year. I will show it to you just a bit after. But first, let's see how the old code would have been written. So first, we create the URL, and actually, I'm going to copy and paste it because there is 100% chance I'm going to make a typo if I try to write it. Let me remove the page argument. We won't need it for now. And so I make the call to this API, to the endpoint upcoming movies, and I provide my API key. From that, time to make the network call. So we're going to use our good old URL session that we are already familiar with when we want to make a network call using a compression handler. So we get the shared URL session, and we would have created a data task with a compression handler had we been writing compression handler based code. But since we are writing publisher, we can use another method called data task publisher, which returns a publisher, and we give it a URL as its input. And now on this publisher, we can do things. For instance, we can map over the result. So here, the result has two things, the data and the response. The response is actually the HTTP response. So it's like the status code, the headers, it's like the metadata of the response in a way. And the data is the body, the binary data that you got. So here I'm only interested into the data. By the way, you can also use a key path syntax here if you prefer that. It's not part of Combine, it's just a nice convenience API of Swift that it can turn a literal key path into a closure. And then on it, we can call decode because we have a pre-made method for that. So we give it the type that we want to decode, movie response.self, the decoder. So it's going to be the JSON decoder I defined in my models file just before. Okay, let me actually make it like that so that you can see the code better. Perfect. And finally, I need to return any publisher, and so I do erase to any publisher. And if I take a look at the code, you can see that here we have, I would so much like to see let me do something like, let publisher like that. Let's comment this. I would like to see the type of this thing actually. but it's not going to be happy because it's going to be like yes, but now it cannot compile the code. That sucks. Because yeah, it doesn't have. Oh no, maybe because I forgot. Maybe because I forgot this. Okay, my bad. So now you can see the type. It's a publisher.decode, so the lowermost, I mean the outermost operator. Then a publisher map key path. So here, then a URL station data task publisher, and with all of the associated types in the middle, like movie response, JSON decoder, etc. So imagine if we had to write this here, it becomes super unmanageable. So before, the solution was to use any publisher, but if you remember in SwiftUI, we don't say any view for the body, we say some view. And there was a reason why we couldn't use the keyword some, so the opaque return types in Combine is because in Combine, our publisher has associated types. And we couldn't, when we use some in Swift originally, we couldn't provide values for these associated types. That's why we couldn't do the sum view. But now we can actually do it since Swift, since the version of Swift that came out last year, so Swift 5.8, I think, we can say. So first, let me put the code back like it was. So just to tell you, this code is perfectly valid. We say we return any publisher, and here we say erase to any publisher, but we no longer need to say any publisher. We can just say some publisher and provide the value for both associated types. And as you can see, it builds perfectly. It builds perfectly even though I have left the call to erase to any publisher, because any publisher is still a publisher, so it's still valid, but this line is no longer required. I can remove it, and it still builds perfectly. So if you're writing Combine code in Xcode today, I would recommend you use this approach rather than any publisher. Not because you will win a lot of in performances, but because the code will be like clearer and it will feel less cluttered. The syntax will be like more on par with what you have in SwiftUI, and you will not need to make this extra call every single time. And that's it. We have implemented our first network call using Combine. So now it's time that we actually use it. So let's go and create a movies view model. This way we will be able to also store the subscription inside the view model. This leads me to an interesting point that I almost forgot to make, which is that, as you can see, we haven't dealt with the subscription right now. It's normal because for now in this code, we are not listening to anything. This code just says how to produce a publisher that fetches movies. It's a recipe, but we haven't started executing that recipe yet. It's very important to understand this distinction. It's the person, it's the object that subscribes, the object that will produce side effects in results to an asynchronous stream being executed that needs to manage the subscription. You don't need to manage it when you just say how to create a subscription. And it's usually the same behavior in Eric Swift, where you will have the dispose bag only where you are listening to the subscription, and the rest of your code would just be returning observables or any kind of observable thingies. Okay, I see I missed a few messages in the chat. Okay, so yes, add property wrapper. So add property wrapper. It's hard coding to the language. You can create your own add attributes with Swift macros, which will be part of Swift 5.9, which will be shipping soon. I think like in September, and it's already in Xcode 15 beta, so you can try it out today. And actually, I have a live stream from WWDC week to discover Swift macros if you want to check it out afterwards. Will the video be available after the stream? Yes, the replay will be available immediately after, and it will be available for free. Same question, it will be available for free after. Do you know if any cancelable is gonna get the Swift 6 treatment, as in any cancelable? That's a great point. That's a great point. I think they could. I feel like today you could use any space cancelable just to hide any cancelable. You need to have any cancelable because you need to have a class. This leads to a very good point. Why do you need any cancelable? Is because any cancelable is a class. The fact that it's a class means that it has a lifetime, it has a day in it, and in this day in it, then you can cancel the subscription. So you need a class, but that class is an implementation detail, and you could hide it behind something else, like for instance any keyword cancelable. I've never tried it. Feel free to try it and let me know if it works. But at least thank you for this question because it raises a great point about what is actually the role of any cancelable. Can you use some publisher input? I hadn't seen it, but great job for thinking about it. Yes, you can use it. We just saw it. I had forgotten the assignment sign. Thank you for catching this. Is it good practice to have global set any cancelable? No. Not a good practice. No. You want to have it at the view model level, and also, like I just said, I guess your message was from before, but you don't need to deal with subscription until you are actually subscribing. And so the code you can see right now on the screen, this code right here, doesn't deal with a subscription. That's why I'm not writing any kind of subscription code. I'm also writing fetch movies as a top level function. Usually you would not do that. You would put it into a struct called services, movie service, that kind of thing. But still, you wouldn't want to deal with subscription there because it will be the responsibility of the code that actually subscribes, actually listens to the subscription. I think I don't think they will. I don't see them giving any attention to combine going ahead. Happy to be proven wrong though. Possible you could also like do it yourself, maybe. Even though for this kind of thing, I would also always say like stick to what everyone does because it makes your code more readable. And even better, there is a better reason now why you want to stick to conventions. It's because it makes your code easier to understand by ChatGPT when you need some help to debug or to write code for you. So that's one more reason to value coding conventions, so that you can be lazy afterwards and ask ChatGPT to work for you. Okay, so now let's move on to calling this method. So let's create a view model. So creating a Swift file, we call it movie view model like that. What does it look like? First, I'm checking my script just to make sure that I haven't forgotten to tell you anything. No, perfect. I'm perfectly saying what I should be saying. All right. So this is going to be a SwiftUI view model. So I will be using SwiftUI concepts. I will not be deep diving into them because there is already a SwiftUI training course on my channel. So let's create our view model as a class. So movie view model. Let's mark it as final. All right. Then let's import combine. So this is a view model. This will need to drive changes in SwiftUI. So let's use observable object here. This changes in iOS 17 and above, but we are still on Xcode 14 for now. So I don't have access to the new observability API. And then I will have a property that will be at published, because when this property changes, I want to update my view, or rather I want my view to be updated. I won't update it myself. That's the job of SwiftUI. I just want to let SwiftUI know. And so I use at published. Remember, if you saw my SwiftUI training course, that at published, as the name suggests, uses combine under the hood because there is an underlying publisher here. So let's call it movies like that. It's going to be an array of movie like that, and I will give it a default value of the empty array. In a real app, you would maybe have an enum with a case empty, case loaded, that kind of stuff, but let's keep it simple for now. And now let's actually implement a way to make our network call. So usually what you would want to do is to implement a method called, for instance, fetch initial data. Sometimes it's called load data, but the idea is you will need to have an entry point into your view model to start the loading. You can notice that I'm not doing it into the init. It's more of a SwiftUI thing than a combined thing, but the init could be called way before the view has been shown on the screen. So remember, you never want to do anything costly in the init of a SwiftUI view or a SwiftUI view model. Rather, in the init of a view and everything that is triggered in reaction to the init of a view being called, here the init of the view model, you want to do it in a separate method that you will call on the onAppear of your view. So here I call it fetch initial data. And so what do I do here? I call the method not get movie because I renamed it, but fetch movies from my services. Okay, then on this, I will map to the results because I'm getting a movie response, and movie response is a struct with an array of movies for the property results. So I get this property. Then I will do a receive on. So receive on, it tells me, it makes me realize I made a mistake. At some point earlier, I told you subscribe on, it's to be able to observe on the main thread. No, it's not the case, and it's a very easy mistake. So you have two operators on combine. Interestingly, you have the same logic and the same equally confusing logic on Eric Swift. So you have subscribe on and receive on. Very important. It's very important to understand the difference between the two of them because it's super counterintuitive. Both operators will determine on which thread subscription code is executed. Receive on will basically determine on which thread your sync code is executed. It's the code which receives the value and basically does side effect with them. So here we definitely want it to be the dispatch queue because you are not allowed to change the value of an published property from outside the main thread because it triggers the UI being updated. Subscribe on is the thread on which the subscription code will be executed, and the subscription code, where it's a bit confusing, is that it's the code to produce the value. You could think it's the code that will be run by the subscriber, but yes, but not really, because it's the code that is executed to produce the value. I'm trying to show you the doc of the function. So we just put main thread here, even though that's not what you would want when you make a network call. It says on which to perform subscribe, cancel, and request operations. So here, these things, I don't need to do them on the main thread. I can do them on any possible thread. It doesn't matter. It's only when I consume the final value that I want to make sure I am on the main thread. So make sure you consume values on the main thread, and make sure to consume these values, you use receive on and not subscribe on. For the fun story time, the first blog article I ever wrote was about wrapping completion handler calls into Eric Swift, and I spent an afternoon not managing to make it work because back then in Eric Swift I was using subscribe on instead of observe on. So it's a very easy mistake to make. Okay, and now that we've said receive on, we can sync. I will actually show you an alternative syntax just a little bit after, but first let's take the most simple syntax, so sync. This time you can see I have to provide both closures, and the reason is that our code can produce errors, and so I need to deal with the error explicitly. So here I will have my completion. So what do? I can switch over my completion like that. I will have the case, okay, finished. So the case finished, I just do nothing. And in the case of a failure with an error, what I'm gonna do is that I'm gonna print error.localize description. Of course, you would want to deal with the error more properly, like log it maybe to a logging framework or a logging service, and then deal with it, show it to the user. Here, I'm just printing to the console. This way, if there is an error, we can see it, but I will keep the code simple. And then for the receive value, so this is where I get my movies. Here, I'm gonna want to update the value. So you could do self.movies equal movies, okay? Then you need to deal with two things. First, you need to deal with where do you put your subscription, because this is returning an any cancelable, and I'm not using it. You can see I have a warning here. Yes, now it's visible. There is a warning here. So we need to create our set of cancelables. So I'm going to create it here inside my view model. This way, when my view model gets deallocated, the dinit of all the cancellables get called, and all the subscriptions get cancelled like that. This way I can do store in cancellables. So this is good, but we also have another problem. So if you're watching the replay, maybe pause it and try to figure it out. Of course, you can imagine what it is about, because we're talking about closures, and whenever there is a closure involved, you know that a closure's best friend is basically a retain cycle. And here I am capturing self inside this closure, and I do have a retain cycle because the closure I pass to sync captures self, the any cancelable captures the closure, and self captures or stores, owns the any cancelable through the set of any cancelable. And so we have come full circle. Self as a reference to any cancelable, which has a reference to the closure, which has a reference to self. So we have a retain cycle which we need to break, and here I'm going to break it by using weak self like this. Normally, we should have our call implemented. So you can see that this time, since I was dealing with a subscription, I had to deal with the lifetime of the subscription. And then I implemented the side effect that was happening in reaction to values being produced. And here the side effect was to update this variable right here. Last thing I need to do is to actually implement the view that displays the movies. So for this, I'm going to paste in the code that I have already made. So something like that. I'm gonna remove this. We will put it on a little bit later. And the navigation link is also going to go. We will put it a little bit later. And there is one extra of these thingies. All right, let's format this back. Okay, does it build? Cannot find view model, of course, because I need to create my view model. So put it as a state object because my view owns this view model and it's going to be movie view model. All right, we are almost good. If I launch the app, nothing will happen because I need to call fetch initial data. And so I'm gonna call it on my list. So I put a on appear modifier on the list, and in the closure, I do view model fetch initial data. All right, let me put the simulator back on the screen right here. I will put it in light mode because compression, video compression is not always very good for dark mode stuff. I launched the wrong simulator, of course. I want to launch the iOS 17.1. I don't need like any unexpected crash or issues. All right, we can see we have both Barbie and Oppenheimer. So you can definitely see that we are at the end of July 2023. Let me just make it so that it stays on top. Perfect. And you can see that the result of our network call is being displayed on the screen. So that's great. We've implemented our first real world use of Combine, which was to make a network call using URL session. Let me go back to the code. So we implemented the network. Let me get rid of the simulator. We implemented the network call using this data task publisher that is given to us by Foundation. And then we mapped over the publisher to be able to transform it, first to query one of its sub-properties, then to decode it, and then to once again map and receive the value and assign them to a property. Then we're going to even improve this code even a bit more. But first, let me look at the chat. I see a few questions. Can you have example for 3 URLs with the same data structure and different data sources? I will show you just after 3 different endpoints. But basically, it's more of a foundation problem than a combine problem. Oh, you mean if I wanted to combine it? I guess you wanted to say if I did like combine latest. So I will show you just after how to combine several streams into one. There will be like the Ghostbuster moment where we are like crossing streams. It's going to come very soon. Another question, hey Vincent, quick question. Will this course about Combine be applicable for UIKit as well? Yes, you can use it for UIKit as well. Only difference is that you will not have like, well, the assign on operator I'm about to show you, you won't have it, but it works for UIKit. And basically, if you need like ideas for architecture, you have articles about Combine and UIKit, of course, but also most of the architecture content you can find around Eric Swift and UIKit is also valid for Combine and UIKit because the two frameworks are so similar. Okay, so first thing here you can see I'm doing sync, but it's a little bit of a lot of work, and maybe I would like to do something a little bit more simple. So how can I do it? There is actually a very nice operator that you can use in Combine that is called assign. But as with all nice things, there is a catch. Why doesn't it work? Okay, it's called assign, but maybe it's because of the receive. Let's see. No, I can do it. Oh, it's because there is this thing here, I think. Why doesn't it suggest a sign? That's so weird. Oh, there is a reason why it doesn't suggest assign. That's what I like when I make a mistake, is that usually there is a reason and it is to a point I really wanted to make and almost forgot to make. Why doesn't it show assign? So assign is a shortcut to basically directly drive the values to a property. So here I want to drive the values to the array of movies. But this begs the question, what do we do when there is an error? Because we can only assign all values if we are sure that there is no error. So that's why I don't have access to the assign operator for now. It's because if I want to have access to it, I need to produce a way to remove the values, to remove the potential errors from the stream. So indeed, the error type should be never. And there is a very nice way to do it. It's to do replace error. I can say replace error with empty array. It's not something we would want to do in production code, but at least it's a nice way to simplify it. And now that I've called replace error with empty array, now I have a publisher that cannot produce error, and so I can use assign. This is where we get to the tricky part. You can see that there is two assign. There is assign to, and you give it a key path, and an object on which to call a key path, and assign to a publisher. It's very easy to say, okay, I'm going to do assign to the property movies on self, like this. This code is going to build. I need to store the subscription still. I still need to store it into an any cancelable. Okay, like this. This code is going to work perfectly. Let me launch the app, you will see. The app is going to work beautifully. But we have a problem. Let's take a look at the documentation of assign to. You can see like this self here, like is going to give us some trouble. You can see it. Let's see what the documentation has to say. Can you see it? I don't think you can see it, so I'm going to make sure you can see it. Okay, here you can see it. Object. The object that contains the property. The subscriber assigns the object property every time it receives a new value. Okay. But here, the subscribers.assign instance created by this operator maintains a strong reference to object and sets it to nil when the upstream publisher completes, either normally or with an error. So actually, in this case, this would not lead to a retain cycle in most situations. Why? Because it says that when the publisher completes, then self, the strong reference, gets set to nil. So here, since my publisher is a network call, it will complete at some point, either because I get the result or because there is a timeout. However, in the general case, when you don't know if the subscription, that's hard to say, when you don't know if the subscription will finish one day and you have subscription that never finish, imagine like you are, for instance, you're doing something like as simple as notification center.default.publisher for notification name. This will never finish because by definition, you can always have a notification being published, so there is no finishing event for this. Then you would have a memory leak because your subscription would keep a reference to self. So be very careful when using this operator. It's so easy to get a false sense of security for this. And even for the case of a network call, I would argue don't do it because imagine you open a screen and then you leave it. It will keep your network call in progress. That might be what you want, but most of the time it's not what you want. So don't do this unless you're really sure this is really what you want. But fortunately, we have the second version of assign, which is even better. This one, it takes a publisher and it's this very weird syntax. You can see we're doing $. This is the most cryptic Swift can get. What's happening is that assign, you basically give it another publisher and it's going to redirect the output of this publisher to the input of this other publisher. And the reason why we give it the ampersand is because the publisher needs to be in-out because we are modifying the publisher. And the reason why there is this $sign is because @publish is a property wrapper and the $sign allows you to get its projected value, which is the underlying publisher of the value. And you can notice that this time I don't need to do a store-in. It's because the store-in is implicit. The reason is that this property is already tied to the lifetime of the instance, and so the underlying publisher of the property is also tied to the lifetime of the instance of my view model. It's created, the underlying publisher for the property movies is created when the movie view model is created, and is deallocated when movie view model is deallocated. And so we don't need to deal with a set of any cancellables in that case, because we already have this underlying publisher that manages the lifetime for us. So it's a really great syntax. I think this one was introduced with iOS 14, if I don't say a mistake. Let me check actually, because I'm not sure. Yes, this one is iOS 14, so maybe you can use it. If you can't, you might find open source implementations of it. I'm not sure, because I've never been in the case where I need to use it on iOS 13, but it's a really great syntax, and a syntax that is even simpler, because you don't need to deal with the any cancelable part. And so you were saying, why does it exist? Because there are cases where it could... No, actually, that's a great question. Why does it exist? It's because there could be cases... Let me go back to the code. Here, I was passing self directly, but maybe imagine, like, I don't know, like I'm gonna write some code, like I don't know, I need a class. I will call it like data store, like this. It will have this thing right here. So now I have a data store. So I'm not making the code work with SwiftUI. So this code would not trigger a view update. I just want to drive the point about combine. And so I could do something like this. Even better if I make it a let constant. I could do something like this. And this is basically is the same logic. You know what? Let me take this code like that. It's the same logic than here. If you wanted to do data store, you could just capture data store in the closure and not self. And it's kind of okay, because since it's a let constant, it will never change. You see, you have this existing code right here, and this syntax here, it's really the equivalent. It's a mapping from one to the other, except that here you don't deal with the error case like you do here, but this code right here, it's a mapping to this receive value right here. And so that's why you have this assign to on operator that exists. Why it makes sense in some situations, but most of the time you don't need it. To be honest, most of the time, I'm just removing this code because it's going to be super confusing if I commit it in the finished version. Most of the time, what I use is this version, so assign to with this, and this is a great syntax. Whenever you can use it, it's a super cool syntax. Okay, let's see what we have next. Oh yes, I wanted to show you that instead of replace error, we could also call catch. And catch, we give it a handler. So in the handler, what could we do? Let's see. We could do, for instance, print $0.localize description. I think I was a bit too ambitious in my use of catch. I think I used catch in an incorrect way. So I'm going to fix this. So catch, you give it a handler that takes a publisher. Okay, so it's not that easy, and I don't have the code in my finished version. So if I will leave it as, you know, like an exercise to the viewer. I'm sorry for pulling this trick, but if you want to see how catch works, but basically replace error, you replace the error with a new value, and catch, you execute a side effect when there is an error. So it's kind of like a sync, except that it only happens when there is an error. And I will remove this code for now. Okay. What else did I want to show you? We talked about some publisher. Oh yes, wanted to show you one thing. So here you see I use the method decode, but if you don't want to use it, or if you need to do some more complex decoding code, you could actually make it yourself. And for this, you would use the method called try map, because you want a map, you're doing a map that could produce an error, and so you would do try map, and then you would do like let decoded equal try JSON decoder, the global one, decode, so the type movie response.self, and you decode from data. Thank you for this. So the logic for catch is that you get the error and then you return a new publisher. So here, just value, it's like doing replace error with, you do like just value empty array. What's nice is that you also have in the catch block, you can also execute side effects. For instance, like logging the error and sending it to like Datadog, or they didn't sponsor the video, but it's the only name that came to mind, or to Firebase, for instance. Okay, so try map like this, and then return decoded, something like that. Let me run the code just to make sure that it still works. Yes. So you could do a try map, and what's great, as you can see, is that try map is a nice API because you can do stuff that can throw an error, and it will automatically, if there is an error, it will send it through the publisher. So you don't need to do like to write a do block and then write your catch block. You can just focus on the happy path and then deal with the error downstream. So I will just comment this so that it's in the code I will commit, and it's still there. Okay. And now to finish for today, let's go with a bit more complex like use cases. For instance, let's implement a way to search. Yes, I want to be able to search in the list of movies. So how do I implement this? First, I'm gonna need to be able to deal with a search query. So I will implement a search query into my view model. So it will be something like this. So add published var search query. So it's whatever the user will type in the search text field. So it's gonna be a string, and by default it will be just the empty string. Now I will also need a way to display a search bar into my view. So it's pretty easy to do, starting in iOS 15. I think it's in iOS 15. You can use the searchable API and just give it a binding to a string. So a binding to the search query on the view model. And now if I relaunch my app in the simulator, we can see that why don't I have my my search bar? I made a mistake somewhere. That's weird. Oh, yes. Why is there a mistake? Is that because if you want your search bar, it needs to be displayed somewhere. And so a search bar, you need to be inside a navigation view in order to be room to put your navigation, your search bar. So now I have my search bar right here. And while I'm at it, because I like to follow Apple Human Interface guidelines, I will also put a navigation title. Okay. So now we have the search bar. Let's say we don't want to see Barbie, we want to see Oppenheimer, we want to see like older movies, like for instance, The Godfather. I'm typing, but it's not typing, which is always a bit annoying. Let's see if I go into like, how do you do that? Keyboard, connect hardware keyboard. Okay. So of course it's not doing anything because I need to implement the network call, of course. So let's implement this this network call. All right. What's the difference between observed object and state object when declaring the view model? So it's a SwiftUI thing. Very quick answer. At state object means that you own the reference. At observed object that you don't own it, you've just been passed the reference. If you want more details, go check out my SwiftUI course and the session about, I think I call it like implementing data flows. And it's explained in much more details. You have 2 hours of this being explained in details in this live stream, in the replay of this live stream. Okay, so what do I need to do? I already have my my models because I'm just going to call the same API. Oh no, actually I won't call the same API. I will call a different API. I'm just going to copy and paste it because so. For the models, it's still the same return type, the same thing in the response, but I need a new function. It's called search movies. As you can see, basically, I have an argument query that I pass as a get argument right here. And the only fancy thing I do is that I add the percent encoding. So like if I do a space, I want to have %20 so that so that it works. Actually, it's always nicer when your code works. So this is the function, but the logic besides that is exactly the same than above, and combine wise, it's exactly the same. So let's go back to our movies view model, because this is where we need to do some work. So how can I implement my searching logic? What I want to do is that whenever search query changes, I want to implement the search and store the result of the search somewhere and display it on the screen. So what I'm going to do is that I'm going to implement the listening of the subscription inside the init. Now, I said just before, don't do anything costly into the init, and now I'm doing something into the init. The reason is that you could do it into another method, but I would say it's okay-ish to do it in the init, because since search query will not change until the user is writing something, I mean, I rephrase it. The issue with doing things in the init is that potentially you do them way before the view is shown. But since search query will not change until the screen is actually shown, that's not really that big of a problem. You have the overhead of creating the subscription, but unless you have thousands of screens, it should be basically okay. Very different if you are listening, for instance, for a notification, because the notification could be sent even though your screen is not displayed, and the subscription code would still be executed. Okay, so how do you listen? Search query, it's at published, so you can get its publisher. So now I have a publisher. I'm going to do a debounce, so it's a way to add a nice little delay. Basically, debounce will do debounce is kind of like the logic of the elevator doors. Like, it's going to wait for 300 milliseconds until it actually sends the new value. And if any new value is sent during that time interval, it's going to reset the timer to 0. So for a value in a search query to be sent downstream, you need the value to not change for 300 milliseconds. And the goal is that if the user is typing, you don't send a new network request every character the user has typed, because it's just like it's stupid. You don't want to discard the previous network call. You want to wait a bit until the user has stopped typing for at least 300 milliseconds to make your network call. So after this, we do a map. So in the map, what we're going to do is that we're going to do search movies for $0, which is a search query. Actually, I'm going to write it explicitly, so it will be like easier to understand. And here I'm gonna say, okay, I want to replace errors with a movie response with an empty array. This will, I think, simplify my code. You can notice I'm using map. It's going to be a problem later on. If you know a bit about reactive programming, you might be like, why is he using map? Shouldn't he be using something else? And then you will see that actually it also makes sense to use map in combine, depending on what you use. But we'll get to that. Okay, now it's time to map to get actually the property results. But you can see, I don't have access to results. I have access to upstream and output. The reason is because since I used map, I was given a search query and I return a publisher, because the return of search movies is a publisher. And so now I have a publisher of publisher. That's bad, because we are back into the initial situation with the nested completion handler. You know, we are back into that situation. So we need a way to lose this level of indentation. We need to lose one dimension. And the way that you do this in Combine, and the same way that you do it in any other reactive programming framework, is that instead of map, you use flat map. You might be familiar with flat map on arrays in Swift. If you have an array of arrays and you call flat map, then you get an array. You lose one dimension. You have the same logic for flat map inside a publisher. When you have a publisher of publisher, if you call flat map, you will lose this extra dimension. So flat map is a way to lose a dimension. Once again, just like just, the name flat map comes from category theory. It comes from algebra. It comes from math. And flat map, you can see it as really a way to chain two publishers one after the other. You have a publisher that produces a value. You need that value to make a call that produces another publisher. The way you chain these two publishers together is by doing a flat map. And once you've done this flat map, then you have as a result a publisher of the type of the inner publisher here. And so it's a publisher that gives us movie response, and on movie response you can get the property results. We are almost there. We just need to do a receive on dispatch queue dot main, pas point main, that's French, dot main. And finally, we need to store the result somewhere. And so I'm going to store it into yet another at publish property. Actually, let me structure the code a bit so it's easier to read and to follow. So it will be at published. It will be called search results. Actually, it will be the same type, so I can just copy paste here. And so I'm going to do assign to and dollar search results. Results, not results. Okay. So we've implemented the logic to make our search. Almost. Because there is a slight problem with this code, is that imagine the user is typing. We send a first request. For some reason, at that point, the network is slow. We don't know, like the network is slow. Then the user resumes typing. The network is much faster now. We send a second request. And the second request returns before the first one. But then the first one returns. What's happening with this code is that we will actually display the result of the second request and then overwrite it with the result of the first one, which is not what we want. We always want to show the result of the latest upstream publisher, because the latest upstream publisher has been created in reaction to the latest changes the user made when interacting with the app. So if you've used something like Eric Swift, you might have used something like flatmap latest. It doesn't exist in Combine, not in SwiftUI, in Combine. You don't have flatmap latest, but you have the same feature that's available slightly differently. So the idea with flatmap latest is that, as the name suggests, you will only receive results for the most recent. You will only receive results for the most recent producer that you have created. And so you don't do flatmap latest. Instead, you do something called switch to latest, except that you cannot switch to latest on the publisher of movie response because it's already too late. So what you need to do is that you need to only map. So you are getting a publisher of publisher, and on this publisher of publisher, here you're doing switch to latest. So it's basically the same logic than flatmap latest in Eric Swift, except that we have split it into two parts. We have the map part here, and we have the switch to latest part here. The only confusing thing is that if you write flatmap first, as you've seen, it's not being suggested to you, and it can be like, why isn't it available? But once you get the logic, it becomes even easier. Why to not cancel the previous request? Honestly, it's possible that switch to latest does it. I'm not sure 100%, but it might be what you want actually in that case. Let's see. I'm looking at the doc. So they do say that it's exactly what we wanted it for. I'm not sure if it cancels. Honestly, I'm not sure if it cancels. Yeah, you can see it you can have a look at it if you want to make sure. I'm not sure what it should do by default, because there are cases where you would want actually the task to finish. You just don't want to deal with the result. So it would be interesting to see which choice that they made. Okay, you said it says that it cancels. Okay, so it in a way it makes sense. And if you don't want to cancel, then you need to do it like to implement this in a more custom way. What is the opposite of on next in RX for Combine? It's sync, and it's sync with receive value. So I'm not using it here because I'm using assign to, but I used it earlier in the live. It's in the live also, but in the live, I used it earlier, and it's sync receive value that you would use. And so we are almost there. Now what we need to do is a bit of SwiftUI magic, because we need a way to actually display either the search results or the array of movies. And here there is a nice little trick, is that I'm going to take my two properties. First, I will rename movies. Yes, I will rename movies to upcoming movies. So I will call it upcoming movies. As always, the big question is there one or two M's? That's why I have a finished project to help me with that. And I will make both of these properties private. they're still at published, meaning that when they are changed, the view is notified to update itself, but the view will not be consuming these two properties directly. Instead, the view will be consuming a property called movies. So what the view is actually already consuming. This way we won't need to change anything in the view. It's a commit property, it's an array of movie, and the way I define it, I say, okay, if my search query is empty, then I'm going to return upcoming movies, else I'm going to return search results. So it's a nice little trick. Arguably, it's more of a Swift UI trick than a combine trick, but I still wanted to show it to you. And so now, build failed. Why? Oh yes, because it also renamed here, even though I don't want it to. So I should have done just like edit all in scope actually. So movies like that. And as you can see, if I search, I was thinking I want to search for The Godfather. Notice how when I change, I need to wait the 300 milliseconds for the new network request to be sent. So the debounce does work and it implemented the search. So if you don't want to watch Barbie, you can watch The Godfather instead. Okay, I'm looking at the time. We are almost at 2 hours, but I think I still have a few things to show you. Actually, no, because combine latest and zip is for the next session. So I think we're going to stop here. Actually, it will be for the next session. Yes, this way we'll be able to pick up where we left. It will be great, and then next time we will go into discovering more advanced combine operators. Maybe a bit about testing an operator. Maybe talk about a bit about back pressure. We'll see, but we'll see like how much time we have to cover everything. But I'm very glad about this first session because I wanted to cover the basics of combine, and I feel like in the 2 hours I've delivered on that promise. Was about to make a very bad joke with promise kit and combine, but I stopped myself right there. But I'm really glad, yeah, about this session. I hope that you have. It's upcoming Phony 1M. Oh my god, it's like I really can't spell English. It's terrible. Whenever I need to write English without the help of autocorrect, it's terrible. If I do my job today almost exclusively in English, and if I had to take an English exam on paper, I would be terrible when it comes to spelling words. That's a very humbling property. Thanks for noticing. All right, we're reaching the end of this first session. If you have any last minute question or remark, now is the time. I'm going to give it a few more minutes so that you can ask away if there is anything that you would like to ask. And I see you are still 20 to watch, which like for 10 p.m. in France in July is amazing. Honestly, it's amazing. Really glad I'm finally doing this. Let's see. Let's wait a bit, and I'm also checking. Actually, if you wanted to implement the detail view, you could do it yourself. As an exercise. We will do it next time, but you could do it yourself. You need to find a way to synchronize two streams, because I would ask you to make it so that the data appears only when the two network call to get the cast members and reviews have returned, and so you would need to use the zip operator. So if you want to do a nice little exercise, you can try to start using the zip operator to synchronize more than one publisher together. Best books I can refer you to. So if it's about combine, you can check out Practical Combine from Donny Valls. Other people have written books about it. I'm pretty sure Paul Hudson have written a book about it, just because he has written so many, like the probability is high. I'm sure that there are other people that wrote great books about combine, but I don't know them that much. The one I would recommend is the one from Donny Valls, Practical Combine. I haven't read it myself, but knowing the content that Donny puts out there, I have no doubt that it must be great. I see a very good question. How come movies don't need to be at published? So it's a SwiftUI question more than a combined question, but it's a great question. What at published does is that at published states when this property changes, the view is notified. That's it. when the property changes, the view is notified. And then the view updates, recomputes its body, etc., etc. And as it happens, most of the time, the property that the view consumes, they are also at published, but there is no need for the two of them to be together. The view can consume a property that is computed dynamically, and the actual underlying property is at published and private. And so what's happening here is that when either these properties when either of these property gets a new value, the view is notified, the view recomputes its body, the body queries the movies property, and the movies property is going to be, depending on whether search query is empty, either the upcoming movies or the search results. So it's more of a SwiftUI trick than a combine trick. Actually, there is no combine being involved here at all, but it's a great trick to know when doing SwiftUI. And I'm not sure that I've shown it in the SwiftUI training course. I might not have shown it, maybe not, but it's a very useful trick, and realizing that a view doesn't need to necessarily observe directly the at-published property is kind of like it gives you room to have like more ideas on how to architecture your code. Let's see. For network requests, wouldn't it make more sense to use a single cancelable instead of storing it into a set, since the fetch could be called multiple times? Oh, you mean so that if you make a new call, then you cancel the previous one? You could have that extra logic, yes. I would say if you need it, then you could have that extra logic, but make sure that you really need it, in the sense that if you're making a network call that sends a small amount of data, canceling it will probably won't change anything because the call will probably have already been made. But if you are uploading, like, imagine you are uploading images, imagine you are Instagram, you are uploading big images, then definitely you want to make sure that if the user has replaced the image with a new one, you cancel the previous existing upload. So apps like, I'm thinking of the WeTransfer app that Antoine Vandely works on, and he talks about it sometimes in his blog articles. This kind of very heavyweight either download or upload, you would want to cancel them. But when it's just like making a small network request, unless you're making one every milliseconds, you probably don't want to cancel to bother canceling the other one, because you will probably gain very little in performance, and you will add complexity to your code that you will need to maintain, that could lead to bugs. So you can do it, but make sure that it's really worth it. That would be my advice. So is combine replaced by async await in most cases? In simple cases, yes. The code I wrote here in combine, it will be so much easier to write using async await. And I think I'm showing it into the SwiftUI training course. So for this kind of code, it will be better to use async await. It's when we will get into some more complex code that combine can have a better value. Basically, when you need to process values over time, that's when combine really shines. And for network code, it's the case where you only need to process one value over time. So it's not the more general case, and so it's not where combine shines the most. Here, great explanation, thank you. If you remove @publish from one of the two properties, will the ID complain? Great question. The ID will not complain. However, now, so yes, it will complain because I'm getting the publisher. So it will complain because of this, because I'm getting the publisher for both of these. But if it wasn't the case, it would build, but when the property is updated, then the view wouldn't be notified and the view wouldn't update. So it would be more of a runtime error, but it would still lead to an error. And I'm saying, what will be in this series for the future? Because I joined late. Later we will see more advanced combine operators. We will see like the more advanced combine operators. We will see how to synchronize several streams together, how to test a publisher. We'll talk a bit about back pressure also. And I think we'll stop there, because the thing with frameworks like Combine or Swift, if you want to really go deep, you need to set up like basically you need to set up a real app for you to have like the scale at which it really shines, and it's a bit too much for a training course. So I think we will stop there. But if you have any ideas for things you would like to know, please say it in the comments of the replay. I read all the comments, so I will definitely see it. Combine works well with WebSockets. Great example of using Combine or any kind of functional reactive programming for that. We used Eric Swift for WebSockets at my previous job, and it worked very well. I see some thank yous. I'm glad to see that you've enjoyed this live stream, and indeed, I think Await works better for HTTP request. And on that, it's a bit more than 10 a.m. for me in France. I think this is definitely time for me to stop, cool down, chill a bit, because then I have a hard time sleeping before like 1 a.m. and I should get some sleep. So I will end the live here. Once again, thank you all for watching. There will be a next session, maybe next week, maybe the week after. I'm not sure, because August is also vacation time, so I might decide to go on vacation on short notice. But the goal for me is for this training course to be finished by the end of August, because September is conference season, and I have a nice September month, so I will definitely want to have this done by the end of August. Just have to say thanks again for watching. Thanks for the great questions and remarks in the chat. It's great for me because it makes it so interactive, and it's great for the people watching the replay. So on behalf of the people watching the replay, I thank you for your interactions in the chat. And now I will finally stop speaking. Just say thank you for watching. Thank you so much. See you next time. Enjoy the rest of your day or of your evening. Bye-bye. See you.